Hey, Terrace Christian Reformed Church. Synod has just finished, Synod 2025. I was able to watch and take in pretty good chunks of it. It seems to have gone well. It was well run, and the mood was calmer than I have seen in the past few years. And there seemed to be an atmosphere of, okay, let's work this out. Let's work through this. And I'm waiting for some of my friends and acquaintances who are now probably on planes with their laptop on their lap, writing reflections on what they experienced there as delegates or as just observers. Some of that is starting to come in, but I'm going to give that general picture first, and then say that there were some disappointing to me decisions. And as always, some of the conversations were interesting, as I hope to note in a little bit. But that's not, so now that that's done, I have time to record my video of this week. And I hope this one's not too obscure to follow, but it is what I have been thinking about basically for quite some time now. And the heading of it could be cultural captivity. So I'm thinking about the cultural captivity of the church in general, the North American church, but then also the cultural captivity of the Christian Reformed Church in North America. And then within that, the cultural captivity of the, I'm going to call it the progressive wing of the church, progressive going all the way out to affirming, which lately has been the biggest enemy or the biggest objection. And then on the right, the returning wing. It's really hard to figure out what to call these. The conservative wing, the traditionalistic wing, the one that claims that we're returning to what we were some time ago, where the confessions and sticking with them and reinforcing them are perceived to be the thing that held us together in the past. So affirming wing, returning wing are the shorthand that I'm thinking about. Both of those, here's the thesis of what I'm thinking about. I believe both wings of the CRCNA need to become much more reflective and discerning around how much of their own culture, subculture, their own ways of thinking, their own worldview is the word that we used to use for that a lot, and their own presuppositions even, have been shaped by secular cultural forces. And in some circles, that kind of thing is referred to as their cultural captivity. So we need reflection from key thinkers in both of those wings on the cultural captivity of that wing. It seems to me that if there's any hope of finding a workable middle, I don't have a whole lot of hope for that, by the way, because so many on the progressive affirming wing have heard doors slamming in their faces. And so they're on their way out in a way that I doubt they're going to re-engage the conversation. And also a person from within one wing critiquing the other for its cultural captivity is not going to work, because that's easily dismissible. Or it's not, it may be very accurate, but because the person is known to be on a particular side of the middle, they will not be taken seriously. Same with this side doing that critique of this one. So that's why I say it needs to be people from within each of those wings who does a sort of a group leads a self-reflection on how have we been influenced by the secular cultural forces to move us in directions that we have taken. And why do they need to do that? Because if these are wings on a dove, that outside influence is what has been pulling the dove apart, the dove of the Christian Reformed Church. And if one of the wings is almost completely lost, then the dove will just spiral. The definition, kind of more formal definition of cultural captivity is this: the melding of religious beliefs and practices with specific cultural norms and values. So the blending of those, potentially limiting that religion's adaptability and applicability in a particular context. Some examples would be, and most of them are mission type of examples, but missionaries who come to a country where the native people do not wear a whole lot of clothes, and particularly for the male missionaries, women's breasts are everywhere. And so the first thing they try to do is get them to cover up. And they couch it in a presentation that is what God would want. Others would be eating particular foods or not eating particular foods. Others would be what to do as a missionary with men who had several wives, right? What part of that is cultural and what part of that is actual Christianity? And so there are many of these, and those are the questions. So let me give another example that I think is kind of fun one. In a church I served some time ago, meeting with the worship committee, and we were talking about how to show some respect. We had a couple of indigenous people in the congregation, and how can we kind of show a nod to their culture in our worship? And so we discussed using actual smudging in the time of confession and assurance. Because when you understand what smudging means to indigenous cultures, it's a cleansing. It's a cleansing ceremony. You wave the smoke over yourself to cleanse yourself for whatever you're going to do next. And so we were talking about creating a liturgy where we could do that in a service. Would that be appropriate or not, right? So that's a cultural activity from another place that we would then bring into a Christian Reformed church for various reasons. And we had come to the point where we had pretty much agreed to do that, but I forget why, but it never came to pass. It was interesting to me that a few weeks later, I ended up sitting at lunch, I think it was, at a meeting in Michigan, beside at a table with a Navajo elder. And so I brought up the topic to him, and he was appalled. So he did not believe that anything that had religious value in the Navajo culture had a place in Christian Reformed worship. So who is culturally captive? I don't know. It is possible for an indigenous person to become culturally captive to the white man's ways as well. So you can't just assume these things. You could even argue that for this man, maybe colonization had been so successful that he had this negativity about anything that represented his old culture. And then on the other hand, I've met with missionaries who said, no, these things have negative spiritual power and influence. And so you do not want to be bringing them into a Christian worship service. Hopefully these all help illustrate this cultural captivity. So my theory beyond that thesis of that we need to have this examination, and it needs to be done within each wing, by people respected within them, and that might create some middle ground. But so for as an example further, the progressive or affirming wing has, I believe, come to some of their views and stances on particular issues, like same-sex marriage, and then even beyond that a little bit, um, um, sexually transitioning from one gender to another. Although that one's not so strong yet, but we were kind of heading there. Their views on these issues, I can be a little bit more critical of this wing because I'm somewhere beyond the middle into that wing's thinking. So I think I have some right to critique. That those what you think are religious practices and values are actually shaped more by the secular culture that we live in than you are aware. And what's an irony in this particular wing is that these values that we take back from the secular culture often began in Christianity. These are values like tolerance, values like self-identity is sacred, everyone matters, don't have any judgment, respect victimhood. That's how they're all existing in our secular culture. But they originally got into that culture somewhat through Christianity. So these are Christian values that were expressed at some time in history and that became cultural values where over time the cross, the gospel, and Jesus were taken out of the reason for those values. And so what now is left is this value of everyone's important. And anyone who claims to be a victim needs to be helped by the society. And so it's a weird loop. Came out of Christianity, the gospel part of it got lost in the secular culture, and then it came back into the thinking of those who are more affirming, more progressive. And that just needs examination. I feel it's my job to just bring it up and to point it out. And there needs to be a reflection on this and an explanation of if some of these are going to remain, then why scripturally and spiritually and even confessionally are they the case? On the other wing, my theory holds that the conservative return to traditional values wing has come to some of their views and stances being formed by other forces in the secular culture. And they tend to be stronger in the US, although they exist in Canada as well. And these are a sort of an anti-academic momentum in the culture, anti-even administrative or institutional momentum in the culture. That these two things are what has been holding our culture back from being truly what it could be. And I believe that also, and then there's a couple others. What did I have in mind here? There's a tiredness of, okay, I'll say it, it's a form of racism, but the white middle class feeling oppressed by the interest in refugees and minorities and all those kinds of things. And so they're tired of that. They actually feel oppressed by that. And they have this wish to rise up against that. Another one is polite speaking politicians, anti polite, that people are just tired of politicians who don't really do things and who don't really say things. In Canada, I can point to Justin Trudeau, our recently our prime minister before this one that we have now. And what were the complaints? He just talks nice, but never really accomplishes anything. And he obfuscates, or that could be said of many politicians. And they've learned how to look like they're answering, but they're not really answering. All of that stuff. Okay. And the same then with a impatience with the media for how they present particular stories and how they feel a responsibility to be properly critical gets turned into something else. So those are forces in the culture. I just watched something on a streaming media. I'm always reluctant to mention brand names. That was a documentary of sorts about Rob Ford, who was mayor of Toronto in Canada for a while. And you can see some of that in there. And there are parallels. There are actually premonitions in his situation of where the US is now. It's very, very interesting. When you see why people loved Rob Ford as mayor, it was because he got things done. He didn't talk like a politician. In fact, some of what he said was quite offensive. He said it like it is in those people's minds. And he was breaking this institutional culture. Now, he had various addiction issues on top of that, which is sad in its own right. But in this documentary, you can see that taking shape, and you start seeing similarities, not full, not 100%, with where the U.S. ended up a little later. So those are cultural, secular forces. I also saw them in the discussion of medical assistance in dying, where the Americans who spoke tended to have completely different perspective on it than the Canadians, some of whom had very direct experience with this with MAID. And I saw it in the conversation about whether guns should be allowed, hidden weapons in ecclesiastical assemblies. So not necessarily, although I guess this would include worship services, but my understanding was this was about like classis meetings or even synagogue for that matter. And like I could show you clips without the person's name, and most people would be able to say, yeah, that's an American, or that sort of thing. All of these, like the whole gun rights thing, are cultural values that have, I believe, infiltrated wings of the Christian Reformed Church. And those wings are captive to them. And only with a healthy self-examination from within each of those wings do we have a good chance of dumping on both sides some of the stuff that is actually not Christ-centered, and then holding the body together in some way. That's what I'm thinking about these days. And I'm working on a written version of it that I hope to share at some point, but it doesn't feel complete yet. And so you got to witness my first oral draft of it as I tried to imagine myself just explaining it to a group of people who are behind that little camera there. Till next time, take care.